Architect Divya Chakravarti. She completed her undergraduate studies from SRM University and she went on to pursue her master's in historic preservation and urbanism and study of the built environment from the University of California, Los Angeles. She went on to work for the Department of Planning and Preservation for the city of Pasadena, California. She also did a brief stint of work for Historic Scotland, Edinburgh, UK. She also worked on conservation projects like Kalsa Mahal, Gokhale Hall in Chennai, and Marimalappa Educational Trust in Mysore. She is currently working as a director of Samrakshan Heritage Consultancy. She is also a co-founder of the Artisan Reprisal of Traditional Materials, Method and Technology. She goes on to conduct workshops to revive traditional and lost methods of construction.
Welcome to the UGC lecture series for Bachelors of Architecture. The subject we are dealing with is evolution of human settlements. The topic we are discussing is human settlements as political expression. The case study we'll be now delving into is planning of Washington, D.C. If you look at the timeline of Washington, D.C. and discussing the main incidents that triggered the successive development of the city, you can see that in 17th century, you have the Native Americans within the coming into the city. In 1788, James Madison argued the necessity for a national capital, where the country did not have a national capital till then. In 1790, the foundation of the district capital. In 1814, the Civil War and raid known as the burning of Washington, which was a political movement basically. Next, in 1871, you have the Organic Act, where you had charters of individual cities of Washington and Georgetown, which created a new territorial government for the whole District of Columbia. Early 1900s, you have Washington was the first city in the nation to undergo urban renewal as a part of the City Beautiful movement. Then the next important state is the 1968, the assassination of the civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King, which broke riots into the city, which made sure that the city had to be reconstructed again. In 1973, the Congress enacted the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. So all these parts of history has triggered the current planning of Washington, D.C. and is a result of why the city is like as it is today. If you look at the historic part of the plan of Washington, D.C., between 1791 and 1800, President Washington appointed Pierre Charles L'Enfant to devise a plan for the new city in the area of the land, actually portray the federal buildings or the government buildings of the capital. This was between the northeast shore of the Potomac River and the northwest shore of the Potomac's eastern branch. So L'Enfant was basically a French volunteer in the Continental Army. He presented a Baroque city plan for the new capital, which was inspired by a French city planning, particularly the plan of Chanteloup. Chanteloup was a proper city in France which was designed following the same principles. This city is oriented north along the 16th Street and it is bounded by the Potomac River and the Anacostia rivers. And next you have the Piedmont Escarpment, which is the modern day Florida Avenue or the boundary street. It was actually notoriously difficult to work with L'Enfant. He was not a very well respected individual because of his temper tantrums and everything. So he was dismissed from the project eventually. So there were a lot of changes that were developed in the plan, and the final plan for the city was based on lots of surveys that were conducted by Andrew Ellicott with modifications made by Thomas Jefferson. So the new plan shifted and straightened the Massachusetts and Pennsylvania avenues, as well as eliminating the destination quality of reservations L'Enfant had set aside for statues, columns, obelisks or any such ornamentation. If you look at the planning principles of what was initially laid out, it was clear it was going to be a Baroque city plan. The plan was made such that it was modeled on large avenues, importance to landscaping. There was clear importance given to government buildings and federal buildings, which was called the National Mall. Then you had a height restriction of all the buildings. Height of buildings should be the width of the road plus 20 feet. which is approximately 6 meters to 6.5 meters, depending on the width of the road. But the width of the road again was very much uniform throughout the city, because it was built futuristically in the way that they knew there would be increase in population. They wanted the city to be urbanized such that people from our surrounding areas would come here and work, because this was going to be the federal capital of the country. So that was one of the main principles on which the city was based on, and it was considered to be light and airy. It should be green. The building should be low and squat, not high-rise buildings, such that there would be national monuments which would be monumental, and the other buildings should be much smaller. This was the typical plan of Lafond which came about. Then Jefferson came up with a plan which was the first long discourse over the identity of the capital, whether it was going to be completely urban or will there be a rural aspect as well to it. So Jefferson's plan was pretty much, if you look at here, blocks of 600 feet by 600 feet blocks, surrounded, anchored by on either end by government buildings, and it was going to be surrounded by green spaces. So this is what Jefferson's plan was, and this is the current plan of Washington DC. So Jefferson's plan also was incorporated in the sense that yes, there was a rural theory kind of adopted into the city with the important green areas. You can see a lot of green areas being allocated. This is the Potomac River and the eastern branch of the same. So the city is actually bang in between the two water bodies. So you have the National Mall, you have the axis. You can see the importance of axis and orientation over here. You can see the different nodes that are being created, the blocks being created at different nodes as well as the intersections. So here everything was at right angles and most of the times. This bird's eye view drawing shows that the South was truly emerging as the civic space of 1860, which was the mall, which housed most of the federal buildings. This place was considered conducive because it overlooked the river, so it had a kind of end point to it. Nothing could grow beyond this. No buildings could come beyond this, and they would have a majestic view of the river. Between 1800 and 1860, what actually happened? From the perspective on the other side of the Anacostia River, one can see the Capitol, the buildings along Pennsylvania Avenue, and the White House, which was built later in 1834. So most of the development came in form of governmental buildings through a dry dock which is visible in the foreground. You can see in that. In the building here, the dry dock over here in the foreground, and all the government buildings that were flocking to the right of the mall. During this period, the Capitol Dome expansion utilizing new steel structural technology began, as did the construction of Robert Mills Washington Monument. So government construction was given priority. Here you can see between 1860 and 1900, the current city you can see is getting reflected in the plan. Axis being given importance. You still have a lot of green space. The built area to the green space area is still not in the proportion you see today. This bird's eye view shows the development of the mall properly. Here you can see the mall being constructed and the neighborhood between it and the Pennsylvania Avenue, which is considered one of the most squalid and dangerous parts of the city even today, because of it even though it's being close to the government area, it has the river on one side, which initially was considered a very positive thing. Nothing else could grow there, but because of the water body on both sides, it causes an area where no one can actually leave, and a kind of negligent area has emerged, which leads to a lot of antisocial activities at that point of time. So between 1860 and 1900, this was the period after the Civil War. They actually were engaged in building massive public works program to upgrade the infrastructure, maintain hygiene in this kind of tropical area because of the increased population because of the end of the Civil War, and the growth of the city had suddenly spurred on because of this. The investment in governmental buildings earlier in the century was obviously very useful, because now the city could concentrate on developing through private enterprises and industries and such like that. Now between 1860 and 1900, here you can see the development of Olmsted Street plan for the Capitol. This is the Capitol complex near the mall, Capitol grounds. So what he actually wanted to do is, let's take Jefferson's approach of pastoral approach. That is, let's give it an impression of it being rural with having a lot of open and green spaces. And then this was going to be the precursor to the Macmillan Commission plan for the entire federal area. So this was a precursor to the entire movement. Let's give the building also importance, but we have to give a lot of green space around it to make sure this looks even more majestic in the crop of short trees and plants. Now we'll go on to Macmillan's plan, which came around between 1900 and 1940. What Macmillan envisioned was a federal district set apart from the rest of the city based on the city beautiful premises. So emphasis was laid on unifying the mall and claiming the area between Pennsylvania Avenue and the mall for federal business. So when this happened, the negative parts and the negative elements were obviously removed. The Lincoln and the Jefferson memorials would form new endpoints for this civic structure. The mall as envisioned by the Macmillan Commission is what we see pretty much as it is today. So what happened at this period of time was finalized. The area on either side of the mall is strictly only for federal use, that is government use, and the mall itself is home to the Smithsonian Monument and museums and many other monuments and museums. The combination of the Macmillan improvements, FDR's expansion of the federal government, and the impending war led to a rapid increase of population. So at this point of time, the city grew exponentially population wise. You can see here automobiles came into being, trams came into being, buses came into being. So this is one of the trolleys near Pennsylvania and 14th Street in Washington DC. You can see the open space over here and the federal building still existing, and the width of the roads are massive. Even though that time automobiles were not prevalent, this was designed futuristically because they knew in the future there would be more vehicles and there would be more pedestrian movement as well. 1900 to 1940, this is the emerging plan of Washington DC. Clear axial plan, very importance given to orientation and axis. The mall was clearly demarcated. Green spaces were still given a lot of importance. Now to current till date, from 1940 to till date, what has actually emerged? It has obviously been a victim of political not commitment. That is, lot of changes were happening, but nothing was regularized as such. It fell truly in the hard times in the third quarter of the century. You can see the future of the city in a few shots that we'll be seeing. Many lots have been cleared for service parking, and the urban fabric is indistinguishable from any other American city by 1970. It actually fell victim to something called the urban renewal movement, because as and when the city changed, parts of America were completely erased and rebuilt completely. So parts of DC were also faced with that. So you can see these are the aerial photos we are talking about. This is the construction of the Pentagon, one of the most important buildings. A new political commitment was given to the city, plus a growing sense by the residents that we should not fall into the trap of urban renewal. Instead, we should lead. So by 2000, the district had rebuilt most of the surface parking lots downtown, and now it has more jobs located in the urban core than any American city. Now, if you look at what happened in Pennsylvania Avenue rehabilitation and the Southwest urban renewal, we discussed that this was where most of the negative elements and the antisocial elements were congregating. So urban deterioration was happening at many nodes at this point. Similarly, urban solutions were offered on either side of the mall. So existing urban fabric was demolished to make way for a new highway and large footprint of federal buildings. You can see this is the site of the Freedom Plaza in 1958 and Freedom Plaza today. Not much of changes with respect to the width of the roads and all that, and especially the open area, but it's more demarcated and more regularized. This here you can see is the Pennsylvania Avenue, or so-called heritage area of the city, or the heritage core of the city, which was not tampered with during the urban renewal movement. We go about discussing the urban fabric of Washington DC. It consists of 5 types of building blocks: the party wall, the office building, the row home, the detached bungalow, the neoclassical institution, and the urban villa. So each makes a distinctive type of block and fabric. The attached buildings have given Washington the necessary density, and it is obviously one of the most densest parts of the country. The neoclassical institution and urban villas are symbolic purpose idealizing the democratic values. That is, it showed that there was a new nation that was emerging. The detached home was typical of any suburban development where families would reside and they would have a home away from the so-called downtown area. So here what happened is, for this to happen, for a reliable suburb to emerge, it meant a reliable public transit infrastructure was also required. The party wall row home was the traditional housing stock of Washington throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Though their heights varied, many had basement apartments and separate entries as well. You had party wall office buildings which maximizes the real estate in downtown Washington. All the building heights are restricted currently to 40.5 meters, and office buildings typically have retail on the first floor with addition to lobbies. So this you can see is the typical block. Here is the party wall office building and when an entire block of office buildings. Here you have the party wall row home and an entire block consisting of party wall row homes. This is a detached house, and here you can see more green areas and density is less. Urban villa, still more, the density is even lesser, obviously lesser families of dwelling. Institutional building, very large footprint, and this constitutes a block by itself. The detached house was introduced in the outskirts of the city, which was reminiscent of a true suburb. The block gave way to suburban serpentine street system, which was typical of the mid-late and 20th century. This building type does not occur within the section of the city which was planned initially by Lafont. That's why it was restricted to the outskirts of the city. So there was a demand for stately space in the capital which drove the development of the urban villas. So they were actually prevalent in the embassy area where you had a lot of diplomatic and charitable functions. This proved to be a processional entrance. The institutional building without doubt plays a very significant part of the landscape. It's set apart about in its neoclassical objects, idealized landscape, green spaces around it, and during the urban renewal in this quadrant, modern buildings were sited much in the same way but without the landscaping. So during urban renewal, all the green spaces became parking lots. So that's what happened at this point of time. Here you can see the DuPont Circle, which is the best example of how Lafont's reservations and square could actually work. This is a vibrant park and traffic rotary column. That doesn't mean it's a park, means it's away from the city. It's right in the heart of the city, which offers a very good lung space. You have three major diagonal roads coming in from here, and it's a mix of commercial, retail and residential units, and this is delineated by corner buildings, streets, medians and trees. This is a true Massachusetts Avenue, is one of Lafont's planned Grand Traverse Avenues. It's 160 feet wide, 80 feet carriageway, that is 80 feet and 80 feet of pedestrian and trees. Modern day Massachusetts follows pretty much the dimensions of Lafont. So no changes in that, except that now it's limited to 135 feet and they share the walls. Here you have Q Street, which is one of Lafont's other streets, that is the lesser important streets. This is around 90 to 110 feet wide. This is basically residential in nature and they are traditionally only 3 or 4 story row homes. So you have a front yard setback, trees and a parking lane dividing the space. If you look at the streets and spaces that emerged over here, a lot of importance was given to the width of the streets. You had 130 feet roads, 110 feet roads and 90 feet roads even in residential areas. So obviously, futuristically, they were planning. Even till date, you do not have congestion as a problem over there. And public transport was given importance at a time when it was not in complete demand. So today's scenario, public transport is very much prevalent. Washington DC gives a lot of importance to its open spaces, which gives it that particular character and makes it stand out from other American cities. This is bright and open, and the setbacks that are provided are prevalent even till date, which makes sure there is adequate trees and gardens which are abundant in the city, and it has gone beyond the original area of the city. And while the grid in the diagonal system breaks down in between, the commitment to the openness in the green belt definitely continues. This, for example, is a Scott circle, which is not a very good example, or rather it's a less successful example of LaFont's reservations. Even though this was formed to be like DuPont circle, now it's become a traffic node because you have 6 important roads coming in here, and it has pretty much become a traffic circle. Here, this is the Rat Park, which is the intersection of 16th Street, Harvard and Columbia. It falls outside LaFont's plan. This is not a part of the original plan, but this is a true example of residual space. After all the leftover space, instead of letting it go wasted or let it go in the sense it could be a place where it's alleyways or it could be filled with antisocial elements, it has been modified to be a lovely park which encourages people right from offices, residences and even institutions to come here and spend the day. The concept of boulevard or wide roads, this was again very important part in LaFont's plan and even till date. If you look at the civic structure of Washington DC, as it was envisioned by LaFont, it was a series of site reciprocal squares, fountains, wide diagonal avenues anchored by a grand avenue, 400 feet in width and about a mile in length, bordered with gardens. It ends in a slope from the houses on each side. So communication was given a lot of importance. If you look at the skeleton of LaFont's civic structure, it remains till date. The only changes is that the reclamation of the tidal basin is changed, and mostly other than DuPont Circle, the importance of squares as a part of the civic structure has never been realized. So only DuPont Circle is a good urban space. Here you have LaFont's plan of 1791, and this is modern day Washington DC 1991. Not many changes occurring. Obviously it's more cluttered and more clustered, but the theory and the principles have remained the same. If you look at the good urban space, what is a definition of a good urban space? If you consider a good urban space and the characteristics of a good urban space, it should be near people, it should be legible to people, it should be accessible to people both in reality and perceptually. That is, even if you are inside a building, when you look at that space, you should be able to relate to that space. Allow multiple layers of activity and movement. So following these 4 characteristics, DuPont Circle is an example of good urban space. It is located in the intersection of an office district, residential neighborhood, and the adjacent density of people is large enough to populate the space. Legibility is obtained through party wall buildings, which is of consistent height, and obvious routes in and out of this space. Despite being an overtly pedestrian area, the circle also serves as a substantial traffic role, being the intersection of the district's 3 busiest diagonals. So this serves to be a true good form urban space. Now if you look at the plan of the mall, we shall go into the defects or the problems that are occurring in the mall. Number 1, it's too far from the urban center of residences and offices. The whole idea of the mall is it is a place of congregation, but if it's so far away from the urban center, it is not some place people would go to unless there's an event over there. The Macmillan plan effectively pushed all functions other than administration north of Pennsylvania Avenue. It loses its legibility west of Washington Monument. So with no built edge to the south, the mall falls into the Potomac and loses its legibility. We just discussed the importance of legibility, of how a person or people should perceive that space even if they are not in that space. Because of the Potomac River, it feels like the mall is just dropping into the river. It is strictly a ceremonial space. Because it's so far away from the urban center, it's not a place people go and visit regularly. The primary use of the mall is to look at it, and mainly tourists come there, and it's an activity engaged primarily by visitors instead of residents. even if residents do congregate over there, it will be on election day, it will be there to celebrate some great day like Independence Day or something like that. But otherwise, it's pretty much neglected. So this is the image which illustrates how the mall is typically experienced as a landscape to be beheld, but not as a space to be occupied. It also illustrates the openness of the western end of the mall with no built edge to the southern side. You can see here there is just the river over there. So you have the green space and just the river. Here again, in spite of being a very important node, it goes there with the obelisk. It is more like a park to be enjoyed rather than a place people would congregate for some important activities. So that's where mall actually loses its significance. Here again you can see the Potomac River on either end. This is the branch of the Potomac River, the eastern branch. You have the nodes marked out over here. Here you have the private areas, the residences, and in red you can find the public or the institutional buildings. And like we've already discussed, this shows that Washington celebrates the mall as basically an urban space instead of a pastoral landscape by developing the reclaimed tidal flats as a new urban neighborhood. So by placing a density of people and buildings on either side of the mall, it populates the area adjacent to it, creates a legible edge, and introduces everyday use of the space in addition to the destination use. So such intervention addresses the challenges of a good urban space. So that's what happened when the reclamation of the tidal basin happened. When tidal basin was reclaimed and buildings were built over there, you had other buildings come about on this side, and that way this got a lot of more importance and people could see this mall from different avenues as well. At the end of this, we have seen and studied the planning of Washington DC. We should be able to answer the following questions at the end of this. Describe the civic structure of the city of Washington DC. What are the defects in the design of the mall? Which part of Washington DC can be considered a good urban space? Describe the urban fabric of Washington DC. That brings us to the end of this lecture. Thank you.